The moon has always been with us. Hanging silently above our heads, it has watched the world change for billions of years. Long before we learned to speak, long before we built cities, long before we gave names to the stars, the moon was already there, shining, turning, waiting. It pulls at the oceans. It commands the tides. It guides the rhythm of life itself. For early humans, it was a source of wonder and mystery, a perfect circle in the night sky that grew and shrank like breath, like time itself expanding and contracting across the heavens. But the moon is not just a symbol. It is a place, a cold, dead world, silent and airless, marked by craters and dust untouched for millions of years. And yet, it is not lifeless. Not in the way we usually mean. Because wherever human curiosity touches, life, in some form, follows. And recently, that curiosity has returned to the moon once again. In the year 2024, something remarkable happened. A small spacecraft from Japan touched down on the surface of the moon. Its name was SLIM, the Smart Lander for Investigating Moon. But people soon began to call it something else, the Moon Sniper. A name earned not by strength or speed, but by precision. In a vast and desolate landscape where landing within kilometers is considered a success, SLIM managed to arrive just 55 meters from its intended target. That's like launching an arrow across continents and hitting the center of a coin. But the landing was only the beginning. SLIM wasn't built to last. It was light, stripped down. Not designed to survive the long, deadly lunar nights. Nights that last for 14 Earth days and reach temperatures colder than anywhere on Earth. Its solar panels were supposed to drink in the sun's energy, but it landed upside down, panels facing the wrong direction. For any other mission, this would have been the end. And yet, it woke up. When the sun returned, SLIM did too. It blinked back to life and started sending data. Images of the rocky surface, samples of olivine-rich terrain near a crater called Scioli, and a quiet signal of triumph. Then night came again, and again it fell silent, frozen. But when the sunlight touched its skin once more, SLIM stirred. It survived not one, not two, but 3 lunar nights. Each time it defied the odds, endured the deep cold, and returned to speak again. This wasn't just a technological success. It was a kind of resilience we rarely expect from machines. A whisper across space that said, "I'm still here." And in that quiet endurance, something changed. The moon, once thought of as distant and difficult, began to feel closer again. Achievable. The Moon Sniper had proved that, with enough care, even small missions could make history. But while one nation celebrated a quiet success, another faced a very public failure. Russia, once the pioneer of space exploration, had planned a bold return to the lunar surface. The Luna 25 mission, its first since the 1970s, was supposed to mark a new chapter, a demonstration that it could still compete in the modern age of space travel. The goal was ambitious: land at the south pole of the moon, where sunlight touches the surface only at low angles and ancient shadows may still shelter frozen water. If successful, Russia would not only return to lunar exploration, but stake its claim in a region believed to be crucial for future human presence. Water, after all, is life. It's oxygen, its fuel, its survival. But Luna 25 never made it. Just days before India's Chandrayaan-3 was due to land, Luna 25 lost contact. A navigational error sent it into a spin, and then silence. When telescopes later found the crash site, it was clear the mission had ended in failure. In a way, its fall echoed a larger truth. The future of the moon may not be shaped only by rockets and science, but by choices made on Earth. Choices about cooperation, about openness, about trust. And so, as SLIM sent back its quiet signals from the surface, and Luna 25 disappeared into the dust, the moon became more than a destination. But the moon doesn't wait. It keeps turning, keeps pulling. And in its ancient rhythm, it holds secrets still unfolding. One of those secrets isn't on the surface, but in the way the moon moves. Every 18.6 years, something subtle happens. The tilt of the moon's orbit, its nodal cycle, shifts slightly. Barely noticeable from Earth, and yet the effects ripple across our oceans. When the cycle aligns with high tides and rising sea levels, the result can be devastating. In the 2030s, scientists warn, we may see a surge in coastal flooding, not because of storms or tsunamis, but because of the moon's quiet breath. Cities built near the sea, from New York to Bangkok, could face flooding on a regular basis. Not dramatic, but persistent. Not deadly, but disruptive. Streets turning to rivers, sewers backing up, salt water seeping into soil. And it won't just affect people. Wetlands may drown, mangroves may retreat, fish nurseries, nesting birds, and coastal forests, entire ecosystems shaped over millennia, could shift or vanish. And with them, cultures and communities that have always lived with the tide. It's strange to think that the moon, so distant and silent, can shape our lives in such intimate ways. But it always has. We just didn't always notice. Until now, the moon's influence was something we lived with. Subtle, ancient, woven into the background of Earth's rhythms. But even something as old and familiar as the moon can still surprise us. Or perhaps, more truthfully, remind us of ourselves. In early 2022, astronomers tracking the lunar surface noticed something strange. A new impact crater. That, in itself, wasn't surprising. The moon is constantly pelted by micrometeoroids and space debris. But this crater was different. Or rather, these craters. There were two of them, side by side, perfectly aligned. As if something had slammed into the moon's surface, not as a single point, but as two masses connected by a shared fall. That doesn't happen naturally. No known space rock behaves that way. What did this mean? Scientists traced the object's trajectory backward and gave it a name, WE0913A. It had been drifting in space for years, a long-forgotten artifact of a mission no one seemed to remember. At first, the likely culprit appeared to be China. The path matched closely with a Chinese rocket stage from the Chang'e 5T1 mission, launched in 2014. But when confronted, Chinese officials denied responsibility, claiming their rocket had already burned up in Earth's atmosphere. Others began to speculate. Could it have been a U.S. military satellite? A commercial rocket from SpaceX or another company? Something secret? Something lost? No one could say for certain. And that uncertainty exposed something uncomfortable. We no longer truly know everything we've left out there. In the vastness beyond Earth's atmosphere, we've lost track of pieces of ourselves. It's easy to imagine that space is clean, that we've only just begun to venture out. But the reality is messier. We've been launching objects into space for more than 60 years. Thousands of satellites, countless boosters and rocket stages, probes, payloads, experimental crafts, failed prototypes. Most of them still orbit something. Some drift in the void, a few crash. And when they do, especially on the moon, they leave a mark that cannot be erased. Unlike Earth, the moon has no atmosphere, no wind, no rain, no erosion. Its scars are forever. And so, with each new impact, we add another signature to its ancient surface. A reminder that we were there and that we may not have been careful. There are no binding global rules for what happens to space junk. No penalties for letting spent hardware drift into lunar orbit. No requirement to track or report objects that are no longer functioning. In fact, much of what we launch is forgotten the moment it leaves Earth. Tracked briefly, then dismissed. That is, until something goes wrong. And as more nations and companies join the race back to the moon, these oversights are becoming more dangerous. What if a rogue piece of metal collides with a lunar orbiter? What if it lands near a planned base? What if it isn't junk at all, but something more? A defense experiment? A surveillance tool? A mistake we're too embarrassed to admit. The mystery of WE0913A raises all of these questions. But perhaps more importantly, it highlights something we rarely talk about. The moon is becoming crowded. Not in the way a city becomes crowded, but in the way a silent archive becomes cluttered with careless entries. The United States plans to return astronauts to the surface by the end of the decade through the Artemis program. China is building toward its own lunar base with long-term ambitions for energy and resource extraction. India, after the success of Chandrayaan-3, has joined the club of soft landing nations. Europe, Japan, South Korea, Israel, the UAE, everyone is watching. And many are preparing their own missions. And then there are the private players. Companies dream of space tourism, of telescopes installed in the quiet shadow of the moon, of mining rare elements from the regolith, of building the first off-world colonies not on Mars, but on the moon. Closer, simpler, a stepping stone to the stars. These ambitions are exciting, but without clear rules, cooperation, and shared accountability, they also carry risk. The more we go to the moon, the more we must ask, who's responsible for what we leave behind? Because the moon remembers. It remembers every footprint from Apollo, every lander, every rover, every fallen flag. It remembers the scorch marks of launches that failed, the debris from experiments long abandoned, the ashes of astronauts' memorials, and now, the unknown crater of a forgotten rocket. And if we're not careful, the moon will remember not just our triumphs, but our negligence. Still, not all is uncertain. There are missions being designed now that may help us return with greater purpose, greater care. Before we send humans back, we must first learn to navigate again, to test our systems, to fly not just for show, but for function, to orbit, to measure, to rehearse the ancient ballet of descent and return. And for that, we built Orion. Before we return to the moon with people, We must first send machines, not just to land, but to orbit, to test, to simulate, to fail safely, and learn from those failures. The Artemis program, named after the twin sister of Apollo, is NASA's promise to go back, not just for glory, but to stay. And at the heart of Artemis is Orion. In late 2022, the Orion spacecraft embarked on its first full mission, Artemis 1. No crew, just instruments, sensors, and silence. It launched atop the massive Space Launch System, rose beyond the clouds, and curved its way around the Earth, then around the Moon. A figure 8 across the sky. A rehearsal, a reminder. It was the first time in 50 years that a spacecraft built to carry humans had gone that far. And it went further than even Apollo ever dared, over 450,000 kilometers from home. Inside were mannequins, dressed in future flight suits. Not plastic dummies, but advanced models rigged with sensors to measure radiation, motion, impact. How would a body feel during launch? What kind of cosmic rays would penetrate the hull? Could the heat shield survive re-entry after circling the Moon? These were not academic questions. They were life and death rehearsal steps for Artemis 2. The mission that will carry actual astronauts around the Moon. And eventually, Artemis 3, which aims to return humans to the surface. The first woman, and the first person of color, to walk where only a few have walked before. Orion moved through space not with elegance, but with quiet confidence. It tested its propulsion, its guidance, its communications, its ability to fly in deep space without constant correction from Earth. Then, after weeks of lonely flight, it returned. The re-entry was violent, a test of endurance. Orion plunged back into Earth's atmosphere at nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour, faster than anything re-entering from low Earth orbit. The heat shield glowed. Plasma blazed around the capsule. Temperatures outside reached 2,800 degrees Celsius, hotter than molten lava. But Orion held. The parachutes deployed, the capsule slowed, and it fell gently into the Pacific Ocean. A journey completed, a promise kept. It was a quiet landing, no one on board, no dramatic rescue, just data, just knowledge, just the slow turning of wheels that will one day carry us back. But to understand where we're going, we must remember where we've been. Because the story of the Moon is not just modern. It's ancient and echoing. And it begins, not with Artemis, not with Orion, but with Apollo. The Apollo program was born not from wonder, but from rivalry. Not from peace, but from fear. It was the 1960s. The Cold War gripped the world. Two superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, fought not with armies, but with symbols, prestige, technology. The race for space became a race for dominance. The Soviets had taken the early lead. The first satellite, the first man in orbit, the first woman, the first spacewalk. Each success sent shockwaves through Washington, through the public imagination, through the hearts of engineers who feared they were falling behind. And so, in 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and made a bold promise that America would land a man on the Moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. It was an audacious goal. At the time, the United States had barely put a man into suborbital space. The technology didn't exist. The know-how wasn't there. The risks were astronomical. But the promise lit a fire, and from that fire came Mercury. then Gemini, and finally, Apollo. Apollo was not just a program, it was a colossal effort, a surge of focus and funding that brought together more than 400,000 people. Engineers, scientists, mathematicians, pilots, seamstresses, welders, coders. People who believed in something bigger than themselves. People who looked at the moon and saw not an unreachable world, but the next step. And it worked. In July 1969, humanity left its first footprints on another world. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked across the Sea of Tranquility, while Michael Collins orbited above alone. The images were grainy, the flag barely fluttered, and the words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," became immortal. For a brief moment, Earth stood still. Over the next few years, 5 more Apollo missions followed, each one more daring than the last. New landing sites, longer stays, lunar rovers, scientific experiments, rocks brought back to Earth, dreams written in dust. But then, it stopped. Apollo 17, in 1972, was the last time humans walked on the moon. The Saturn V rocket, still the most powerful ever flown, was retired. The program ended not because we had nothing left to learn, but because the world changed. Politics shifted, budgets tightened, public interest waned. The moon became, once again, a distant place. A memory? For decades, we looked elsewhere. Space shuttles orbited Earth. Probes traveled to Jupiter, Saturn, Mars. The International Space Station was built, floating in low Earth orbit, a symbol of cooperation, of endurance. But the moon? It remained untouched. A ghost of a golden era. A place we had been, but not returned to. And yet, it never stopped calling. The rocks we brought back still tell stories. About the early days of the solar system. About how the moon formed from a colossal collision between Earth and a Mars-sized body. About how its surface was once molten, its core still faintly magnetic, its hidden side rugged and mysterious. The moon, for all its silence, still had more to say, but this time the return would be different. We are not going back for flags or footprints. We are not racing anyone, not really. We are going because we understand now that the moon is more than a symbol. It is a gateway, a place to test technology, to prepare for Mars, to learn how to live on another world, to extract water from ice, to build with lunar regolith, to power stations with sunlight that never sets at the poles, and perhaps, most importantly, to see what it means to stay. That is the promise of Artemis, to build a sustainable presence on the moon, to create a new chapter in human history, not as visitors, but as settlers. We are returning with better tools, better knowledge, and a clearer sense of purpose. And in doing so, we also return to something within ourselves, a kind of wonder, a kind of courage, a kind of hope that has always reached toward the stars. The moon has waited, quietly, patiently, watching us grow, stumble, dream. Now, we are coming back, and this time, we're staying. The decision to return to the moon isn't just a technical challenge, it's a philosophical one. It asks us, what kind of explorers are we? What kind of caretakers? Because the moon is not just a rock orbiting Earth. It is a record, a memory, a mirror. It reflects our light, yes, but it also reflects our choices, our ambitions, our mistakes. It holds the first footprints of another world. It holds the rusting remains of old machines, the quiet experiments left in lunar soil, the flag that may no longer stand. It holds the stories of people who dared to go, and of those who watched from below, dreaming. And it waits, not passively, but with presence, with gravity, with influence. It pulls at our oceans, and it pulls at our minds. It inspires art and science and love. It reminds us that we are part of something larger, that our planet is not alone, that even in the vast dark of space, there is a companion, a constant, even when clouds cover the sky, even when cities forget to look up, even when decades pass without a single rocket rising toward its face. The moon remains. It reminds us that space is not only about escape, it's about return. Return to wonder. Return to questions. Return to ourselves. Because when we go to the moon, we are not just carrying flags and logos. We carry our languages, our laughter, our science, our fears, our music, our memories, our mistakes. We carry Earth. And maybe, just maybe, we carry the first pieces of a future where the stars are not just distant lights, but destinations. So the next time you look up at the moon, remember this. It's not far. Not really. Only a few days' journey away. But more than that, it's close in another sense. It's close to our hearts, our history, our hope. And now, after all this time, we are reaching again. And the moon, ever patient, ever present, is still there, waiting. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like and subscribe to support me.